plane was ready for takeoff. Passengers had just begun to find comfort in their seats when an unexpected commotion shattered the calm. In the midst of hushed conversations and the soft rustling of luggage, a flight attendant abruptly halted before two young boys seated in first class. Her face contorted in a mix of determination and concealed uncertainty, and in the span of a heartbeat, the boys were forcefully led away, exposed and shamed before the entire cabin. There was no forewarning, no opportunity for explanation. In an instant, everything familiar vanished. Yet, unbeknownst to her, the fateful error she had just committed would ripple through her life, returning with a vengeance in a manner so unforeseen that, by the time its full impact struck, redemption would already be out of reach. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. The airport was alive with movement. Within the vibrant terminal, every step and whispered conversation wove a tapestry of anticipation and farewell. The air hummed with the collective energy of travelers hurrying to catch their dreams, while distant boarding announcements punctuated the constant murmur of excitement. In the midst of this dynamic scene, Rylan Harrington and his younger brother Rylan navigated the bustling corridors with an air of joyful determination. Earlier, their father had surprised them with first-class tickets, a dazzling reward for their hard work in school, filling their hearts with exhilaration and a sense of boundless possibility. At 15, Ian's quiet confidence shone through as he gently guided 13-year-old Rylan, whose contagious energy transformed every step into a mini-adventure. Arriving at the boarding area, Ian confidently presented their tickets to the gate agent, who scanned them with a swift, courteous nod. "You're all set. Enjoy your flight." Stepping onto the jet bridge, they felt a surge of anticipation. The cool, soothing air inside the aircraft was a welcome escape from the crowded terminal. The subtle aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with soft, murmured conversations, creating an oasis of calm luxury. A diligent crew member confirmed their seat assignments and directed Rylan to his seat, accentuating the exclusive ambiance of first class. Settling into the refined comfort of their surroundings, Rylan's eyes lit up as he reached for the in-flight entertainment screen. "This is crazy," Rylan whispered, pressing buttons excitedly. "We've never had seats this big before." Ian smirked, adjusting his armrest. "Yeah, well, we earned it." Their quiet banter blended with the soothing background hum of the cabin, encapsulating a moment of pure, unfiltered joy amid the journey. As more passengers made their way into the cabin, Samantha Parker, a seasoned flight attendant with over 15 years of experience, began her meticulous walk down the aisle. Known for her unwavering efficiency rather than overt warmth, Samantha's sharp eyes were always alert to every detail. When she spotted the two boys seated comfortably in first class, an inquisitive pause overtook her stride. Drawing closer, with arms crossed, she addressed them in a polite yet firm tone. "Excuse me, are you two in the right seats?" Ian looked up, caught off guard. "Yes, we have first-class tickets." Samantha's gaze shifted between the siblings, a note of skepticism lingering as she inquired, "Where are your parents?" Rylan blinked. "We're traveling alone," he answered, his lips pressed together. "I see." Ian slid his hand into the depths of his hoodie pocket and retrieved his boarding pass with a deliberate calm. "Here," he said, handing it over. Rylan, with a mix of excitement and quiet pride, mirrored his brother's action. Samantha took the tickets, her eyes narrowing as she studied them intently. She lingered a beat longer than expected, turning the passes over in her hands as if searching for a discrepancy. before silently returning them. "I'll be right back," she said before turning and walking toward the front of the cabin. Ian frowned, watching her retreat. "That was weird," he muttered under his breath. Rylan shifted in his seat. "Why do I feel like she doesn't believe us?" The brief interaction rippled through the cabin. Curious glances were exchanged among nearby passengers, while others averted their eyes, lost in their own thoughts. The once inviting atmosphere of first class now carried an undercurrent of tension. A few minutes later, Samantha reappeared, accompanied by Jack Turner, the senior flight attendant whose every step radiated quiet authority. His face was inscrutable as he approached, leaving little room for misunderstanding. "We need you both to come with us," Samantha said, her voice firm and unmistakable. Ian sat up straighter, a mixture of confusion and apprehension creeping into his tone. "Why? What's wrong?" he asked. "There's been a mistake with your seating," she said, her patience clearly thinning. "You need to move." Rylan's face fell. "But we have first-class tickets," he repeated in a smaller voice. Jack cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "Boys, let's not make this different." Though Ian clenched his fists with anger bubbling beneath the surface, he knew that arguing would only worsen the situation. Taking a slow, steadying breath, he grabbed his backpack, and Rylan hesitated a moment before doing the same. As they stood, the energy in the cabin shifted palpably. Onlookers watched in silent curiosity, some stealing quick glances before returning to their magazines or phones. Samantha Parker led them down the aisle toward the exit, her posture stiff and her expression unreadable. Ian Harrington and Rylan Harrington passed by rows of silently observing passengers, each step heavy with the weight of unspoken questions. The moment they stepped off the plane, a member of the ground staff, Claire Martin, was already waiting for them. "Step aside, please," Claire Martin instructed, motioning them toward a nearby seating area. The second they were off the plane, Rylan Harrington pulled out his phone and typed a quick message with shaky fingers. "They made us leave our seats," Rylan Harrington said. "There was a mistake, but we had our tickets." He hit send, his stomach twisting as a reply came almost instantly. "Dad, what flight number?" Ian Harrington read the message and exhaled slowly. "He's going to be mad," he muttered. Rylan Harrington nodded, really mad inside. In the wake of the unsettling encounter, the world outside the aircraft felt transformed, every detail heightened by uncertainty and simmering anxiety. Back inside, Samantha Parker re-entered the first-class cabin with a composed efficiency, dusting off her hands as if dismissing a minor inconvenience. She exchanged a brief, knowing nod with Jack Turner before declaring, "Problem solved," unaware that her decision was setting off ripples that would soon be impossible to ignore. The atmosphere in the terminal had shifted. Where once the air buzzed with optimism and ease, now a chill of apprehension lingered among the hurried passers-by. Ian and Rylan found themselves confined to rigid chairs near the gate, the weight of their backpacks echoing the burden of their thoughts. Every passing face, every murmured conversation now seemed loaded with judgment and unasked questions. Rylan's eyes darted repeatedly to his phone, desperate for reassurance from their father, while Ian's mind raced, rehashing the incident and its possible repercussions with growing dread. "She didn't even check properly," Rylan muttered, his fingers tapping nervously against his leg. "She just looked at us and decided we didn't belong." Ian exhaled slowly as if trying to dissipate the tension. He added quietly, "Just us?" His grip on his phone tightened with each passing second, and before he could voice his worry further, "Do you think Dad is going to—" The phone vibrated urgently. He quickly unlocked it and read the new message. "Dad, stay where you are. I'm handling it." Over Rylan's shoulder, Ian read the message and allowed himself a reluctant smile. "That means she's in trouble." Rylan smirked slightly. "Good." Meanwhile, back aboard the plane, Samantha Parker moved through the cabin with clinical precision, methodically checking overhead bins and adjusting every small detail to restore a sense of order. To her, the issue was already a closed chapter. Her instinct had prevailed, and any lingering doubt was quickly swept aside. She offered the passengers a practiced, professional smile as she addressed them. "Apologies for the delay," she said smoothly. "We had to clear up a seating issue, but everything is taken care of now." While many nodded politely, a few could not mask their lingering curiosity. An older woman in seat 3, dressed in a sharp navy blue blazer, peered at her with a hint of skepticism. "Weren't they not supposed to be here?" she asked softly. Samantha straightened her posture and replied, "It was just a misunderstanding," her tone brisk yet rehearsed. The woman didn't seem convinced but said nothing more. At the front of the plane, Captain Robert Flynn was reviewing flight details with his co-pilot when the in-flight phone beside him rang. He answered the call with the expectation of a routine check-in, but what came next was anything but ordinary. A low, serious voice resonated on the other end. "This is Lucas Shaw, Executive Manager of Airline Operations. We just received a direct call from the CEO's office." The captain's grip on the receiver tightened imperceptibly as he absorbed the unexpected news. "Go ahead. Did a flight attendant just remove 2 unaccompanied minors from first class?" he inquired, his eyes momentarily drifting toward the now unusually quiet cabin. He recalled that there had been a briefing about unaccompanied minors on board, yet no mention of any seating discrepancies had been made. "I wasn't aware of any removal," Captain Robert Flynn admitted. "Well, it happened," Lucas Shaw replied in a clipped tone. "And the CEO himself is on his way to the airline's operations center right now." Captain Robert Flynn's eyes narrowed. "The CEO?" "Yes," Lucas Shaw confirmed. "James Harrington. And those 2 boys. They're his sons." A heavy silence ensued, laden with the weight of impending consequences. Leaning back, the captain exhaled slowly, the gravity of the situation sinking in. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a disaster. Who was responsible for this? He demanded. "The report says a senior flight attendant, Samantha Parker," came the measured reply. Captain Robert Flynn nodded, recalling her reputation for unwavering efficiency and a rigid adherence to protocol. "I have worked with her before. Efficient, experienced, unbending. Put me through to her," he instructed. "Lucas Shaw," came the clipped response. "Already done." "You'll want to handle this quickly." Setting the receiver aside, Captain Flynn activated the in-flight announcement system. His steady, firm voice filled the cabin. "Miss Parker, report to the cockpit immediately." At that moment, Samantha Parker, who had been methodically moving through the first-class cabin, paused mid-step. A few curious passengers finally lifted their eyes to the announcement, sensing that something significant was unfolding. With a hint of uncertainty flickering in her eyes, a sensation she hadn't experienced in years, she turned on her heel, adjusted her uniform with deliberate care, and made her way toward the front of the plane, unaware of what awaited her behind the cockpit door. Samantha Parker stepped into the cockpit, the door closing behind her with a soft, final click. Captain Robert Flynn sat with an intensity that bordered on steely resolve, his posture rigid and his expression unreadable. The atmosphere inside was charged with tension, every second stretching longer than the last. Without a customary greeting, he leaned forward, his hands clasped together as if bracing for an explanation. "Ms. Parker," he began, his tone sharp but controlled. "I need an explanation." Samantha Parker kept her back straight, her tone even despite the rapid beating of her heart. "Sir, there was a seating issue in first class," she said evenly. "Two unaccompanied minors were in premium seats. Given the circumstances, I made the call to remove them and reassign their seating." Captain Robert Flynn's steady gaze never wavered. "And what circumstances were those?" he asked. Samantha Parker hesitated just for a second, but she quickly recovered, choosing her words with care. "They were alone," she answered. "It seemed out of place. I wasn't informed of any minors traveling in first class, and I had to act quickly." "It seemed out of place. I wasn't informed of any minors traveling in first class, and I had to act quickly." Captain Robert Flynn let out a slow breath. "Did you check the manifest?" His stomach twisted. "Yes or no, Ms. Parker?" His lips parted slightly, but no answer came. Captain Robert Flynn's jaw tightened. "Did you verify their tickets with the gate agent?" Another pause. Samantha Parker suddenly felt the air in the cockpit grow heavier. "I looked at the tickets," she said, her voice quieter now. But Captain Robert Flynn shook his head. "You didn't verify, you assumed. Your throat went dry. You didn't raise your voice, but my words carry weight. The two passengers you removed from first class were Ian Harrington and Rylan Harrington, the sons of James Harrington, the CEO of this airline. Do you know who their father is?" His pulse quickened. "James Harrington," Samantha Parker managed. A cold chill ran down her spine. Captain Robert Flynn continued, his voice like steel. "Right now, James Harrington is personally reviewing this situation. You have single-handedly created an incident that will not only affect this flight, but could result in severe consequences for the airline." Samantha Parker swallowed hard. The dryness in her throat made it difficult to speak. Captain Robert Flynn's next words came slowly, deliberately. "You will return to the boys, personally apologize, and escort them back to their original seats in first class immediately." She opened her mouth, ready to argue, to say she had only been doing her job, but the look in his eyes told her this wasn't up for debate. "Do I make myself clear?" he asked. Samantha Parker clenched her fists at her sides, but forced a nod. "Yes, Captain." "Then fix your mistake," Captain Robert Flynn said, turning away from her. She felt the heat in her face as she turned on her heel, stepping out of the cockpit. The moment the door shut behind her, she let out a slow breath, her hands slightly trembling. Passengers continued settling in, oblivious to what had just happened behind the cockpit door, but Samantha Parker felt it, the shift. For the first time in her career, she wasn't in control of the situation, and she had no idea what was waiting for her. When the plane landed, Samantha Parker walked stiffly down the aisle, her heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. She had handled difficult passengers, strict supervisors, and high-pressure situations before, but nothing compared to this. The moment she stepped back into the first-class cabin, she could feel the shift in energy. Some passengers had heard the announcement from the captain. Others had noticed the way she had walked two young boys off the plane just minutes ago, and now they were watching her, waiting to see what would happen next. Rylan Harrington sat with his arms crossed, staring down at his phone, while Ian Harrington sat upright, his expression unreadable. They hadn't spoken much since their father's message, but they knew something was happening. Samantha Parker stopped in front of them, forcing a tight smile. She crouched slightly to meet their eye level, her voice quieter than before. "There's been a misunderstanding," she said, her tone measured but strained. "I'd like to escort you both back to your original seats in first class." Rylan Harrington looked up from his phone, his eyebrows raising slightly. "Now you want us to come back?" Ian Harrington studied her closely. "What changed?" Samantha Parker's jaw tightened. "It was an error in seating," she said quickly, avoiding eye contact. "I apologize for the inconvenience." Ian Harrington didn't let her off easily. "You didn't ask anyone else for their ticket," he pointed out. "Just us." The cabin was quiet now. Passengers were listening. Some had shifted slightly in their seats, glancing at one another, pretending not to be interested while hanging on to every word. Samantha Parker pressed her lips together. She had been in control for years, never second-guessed, never questioned. But now she was standing in front of two boys who weren't letting her escape the weight of her decision. "I may have misjudged the situation," she admitted, forcing herself to stay composed. "But I'd like to correct it now." Ian Harrington exchanged a glance with Rylan Harrington before looking back at her. "You didn't just misjudge," he said evenly. "You embarrassed us in front of everyone." Samantha Parker swallowed. The heat in her face returned. She wanted to end this conversation quickly, to move past it, to act like it never happened. But the moment stretched longer than she had anticipated. Passengers were no longer pretending to ignore them. A woman in seat 3D shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting between Samantha Parker and the boys. A man in seat 4A adjusted his tie, clearing his throat. The uncomfortable truth had settled over the cabin. Everyone had seen what happened, and no one had spoken up. Rylan Harrington leaned back slightly, crossing his arms. "Dad told us to take our time," he said casually, looking at Ian Harrington. "So maybe we shouldn't be in a hurry." Ian Harrington smirked slightly. "Yeah," he agreed. "Maybe we should make sure we actually belong here first." Samantha Parker clenched her jaw, forcing her voice to stay level. "I understand if you're upset," she said, choosing her words carefully, "but I need you both to return to your seats now." Rylan Harrington held up his phone. "Maybe I should ask Dad first," he said, making her stomach tighten. Passengers murmured. Now whispers were carrying across the rows. They knew. Samantha Parker exhaled sharply and took a small step back. "Of course," she said stiffly. "I'll give you a moment." She turned on her heel and walked toward the galley, her hands cold and clammy. She had never felt like this before, completely powerless. Meanwhile, Ian Harrington leaned toward Rylan Harrington and sent him a message, speaking quietly. Rylan Harrington nodded, typing quickly. "Rylan, she wants us to come back. What do we do?" Seconds later, their father's response came. "Dad, make sure she understands what she did." Ian Harrington smirked, sliding his phone into his pocket. "Guess we're not in a hurry after all." And just like that, the power had shifted. Samantha Parker stood in the galley, gripping the edge of the counter, her breathing shallow. She could still feel the eyes of the passengers on her, their whispers carrying through the cabin like an invisible weight pressing down on her. She had always been the one enforcing the rules, the one who kept things running the way they should. But now, for the first time in her career, she wasn't in control of the situation, and she had no idea what was waiting for her. Across the cabin, Ian Harrington and Rylan Harrington remained seated in the economy section, making no effort to rush back. Ian Harrington leaned back against his chair, tapping his fingers against the armrest, while Rylan Harrington scrolled through his phone with a smug expression. Neither of them was in a hurry. Rylan Harrington glanced at his screen and chuckled. "He's still texting." Ian Harrington smirked slightly. "What did he say?" Rylan Harrington read the message out loud. Dad, she made a decision, now she needs to live with it. Don't move until she actually apologizes. Ian Harrington raised an eyebrow. Not just an apology, an actual apology. Rylan Harrington grinned. I like his style. Meanwhile, in the galley, Eva Williams, a younger flight attendant who had been observing the entire situation, hesitated before stepping closer to Samantha Parker. Are you okay? She asked cautiously. Samantha Parker shot her a sharp glance. I don't need your concern, Eva. Eva Williams held up her hands in surrender. I was just asking. She leaned against the counter, watching Samantha Parker closely. You know this isn't going away, right? Samantha Parker turned away, pretending to be busy organizing a tray. It was a misunderstanding, she muttered. Eva Williams scoffed. Misunderstanding? You didn't question a single other person in first class, just them. Samantha Parker's grip on the tray tightened. Let me guess, Eva Williams continued. You thought they didn't belong. You assumed something. Samantha Parker didn't respond. Eva Williams sighed, shaking her head. I've worked under you long enough to know you don't like being wrong, but this is a whole different level of bad. Samantha Parker set the tray down with a little too much force. I already spoke to them, and how did that go? Eva Williams asked, folding her arms. Samantha Parker shot her a glare before turning toward the aisle. I'll handle it, she said. Eva Williams watched her go, muttering under her breath, not the way you think you will. Samantha Parker straightened her uniform and walked back down the aisle toward Ian Harrington and Rylan Harrington. The boys looked up as she approached, but neither of them moved. She cleared her throat. Are you ready to return to your seats? Ian Harrington leaned back, his arms resting comfortably on the armrests. Are you ready to actually apologize? Samantha Parker stiffened. I already said it was a misunderstanding. Rylan Harrington raised an eyebrow. That's not an apology. Samantha Parker exhaled sharply, glancing around at the watching passengers. She hated this. She hated feeling like she had lost control of the situation, but she could see it clearly now. Their father's message had given them the upper hand, and they weren't going to budge until she did this the right way. To keep her voice even, she met their gaze. I shouldn't have assumed you weren't supposed to be in first class, she admitted. I was wrong, I apologize. Rylan Harrington tilted his head. For what, exactly? Samantha Parker clenched her jaw. For questioning your tickets, for making you leave your seats. Ian Harrington nodded, finally pushing himself up from his chair. That's better. Rylan Harrington stood as well, adjusting his backpack. Took you long enough? The flight was silent as they walked back through the aisle, every pair of eyes following them. This time, the passengers didn't ignore them. They saw everything. As they reached their first-class seats, Ian Harrington settled in, adjusting his seatbelt, while Rylan Harrington leaned toward him, whispering, Dad's going to love this update. Samantha Parker turned to leave, but Ian Harrington's voice stopped her. Oh, and Miss Parker, he said, his expression stiff. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the weight behind his words. If you're going to apologize, make sure it's not just because you got caught. Samantha Parker held his gaze for a second longer before turning away, her face burning for the first time in her career. She wasn't the one giving orders, and she hated it. Samantha Parker walked briskly back toward the galley, her heart hammering in her chest. Every step felt heavier than the last. She knew the moment she turned around, the whispers would start again. The passengers had seen everything. They had witnessed her make a snap decision, humiliate two boys, and then be forced to backtrack when she realized who they were. She reached the galley and leaned against the counter, inhaling deeply. Eva Williams was still there, watching with an amused expression. "So, how'd that go?" Eva Williams asked. Samantha Parker shot her a sharp look. "Not now." Eva Williams smirked. "I'll take that as terribly—" Samantha Parker ignored her and grabbed a stack of cups, pretending to busy herself, but her hands were trembling. Eva Williams leaned against the counter, folding her arms. "You still don't get it, do you?" Samantha Parker exhaled slowly, willing herself to stay calm. "I handled the situation." Eva Williams raised an eyebrow. "You think this is handled?" She scoffed. "You pulled 2 kids out of first class based on nothing but your own assumptions, then you made them walk back through the cabin like they had done something wrong, and now you think an apology is enough to erase that?" Samantha Parker pressed her lips together, not answering. Eva Williams didn't let up. The fact that they had to demand an apology tells you everything you need to know. Samantha Parker turned her back on her, pretending to organize napkins. "I don't need a lecture." Eva Williams let out a dry laugh. "Oh, you're going to get one, whether you like it or not." She tilted her head toward the first class section. "Because you know who else isn't going to let this slide?" Samantha Parker didn't have to ask. She already knew James Harrington. She could still feel the heat rising in her cheeks. A mistake like this on any other flight might have been brushed aside, dismissed with a simple report and a warning. But this mistake involved the CEO's sons, and the entire company was about to find out about it. Meanwhile, back in first class, Rylan Harrington pulled out his phone, his fingers moving quickly over the screen. Ian Harrington glanced at him and smirked while updating him. Rylan Harrington nodded. "Of course, Rylan, she finally apologized. Took her long enough." A few seconds later, their father's reply came through. "Dad, good. Sit back and relax. I'm handling the rest." Ian Harrington raised an eyebrow as he read the message over Rylan Harrington's shoulder. "That doesn't sound good for her," he murmured. "I mean," Rylan Harrington grinned. "Nope, not at all." At the front of the plane, the in-flight phone buzzed. Samantha Parker froze. The other flight attendants turned toward her, their expressions wary. Eva Williams gave a slow nod. "That'll be him." Samantha Parker's stomach twisted as she reached for the phone. Her hand was unsteady as she lifted the receiver to her ear. A deep, calm voice came through the line. "This is James Harrington." Samantha Parker's breath caught in her throat. "I need to talk," the voice continued. Samantha Parker swallowed hard, gripping the phone tightly. The hum of the aircraft felt distant, now drowned out by the weight of the voice on the other end. James Harrington didn't sound angry. He didn't need to. His tone was calm, measured, the kind of calm that carried more danger than yelling ever could. "Mr. Harrington," Samantha Parker started, forcing her voice to remain steady. "You removed my sons from first class without checking their tickets properly." "You didn't verify anything, you assumed," James Harrington interrupted smoothly. Samantha Parker felt her throat tighten. "Sir, I understand that you don't—" He cut in. "If you had not done this, this conversation wouldn't be happening." A heavy silence stretched between them as Samantha Parker's fingers clenched around the phone cord. She had faced difficult passengers before, strict supervisors, even demanding executives. But this was different. This wasn't someone looking for an excuse or a scripted response. This was the man who owned the airline, demanding accountability. "I've already apologized to them," she said, trying to regain some control. "I escorted them back to first class." James Harrington let out a slow, unimpressed breath, and Samantha Parker blinked. "Do you think that's enough?" James Harrington asked, his voice unreadable. "You think a forced apology fixes what you did?" Samantha Parker felt the pressure building in her chest. "It was a mistake," she said, her voice quieter now. "A misjudgment?" James Harrington corrected. "No, it was a choice." Samantha Parker flinched slightly. "You didn't ask anyone else to prove they belonged in first class," he continued. "Just them. You didn't check the manifest, you didn't call the gate agent. You didn't even stop to consider that you were the one who made a mistake." Samantha Parker remained silent. There was nothing she could say that would make it sound better. "My sons don't need your approval to sit in first class," James Harrington said, his voice lower now. "They had their tickets, they followed the rules. You're the one who didn't." Samantha Parker felt her breath turn shallow. She had never felt this way. She had been in the industry for 15 years. She knew every policy, every regulation, and yet here she was, exposed. "Do you understand what happens next?" James Harrington asked. Samantha Parker's mouth felt dry. "Mr. Harrington, I assure you, you're going to file a full incident report the moment this flight lands," he said, his voice sharp. "Not an excuse, not a scripted apology, a report. I want to see exactly what went through your head when you decided my sons didn't belong in those seats." Samantha Parker's heart pounded. "Sir, And then James Harrington continued, his voice dropping to a cold finality. "You're going to explain yourself in front of the executive board, the same board that determines whether or not you keep your job." The blood drained from her face. James Harrington added, "I suggest you use the rest of this flight to think very carefully about how you're going to justify what you did." "James Harrington," he said, and then the call ended. Samantha Parker stood there, frozen, the receiver still pressed to her ear. The low hum of the disconnected line rang in her ears, but she couldn't move. Eva Williams, who had been watching the entire time, raised an eyebrow. "So, how'd that go?" she asked. Samantha Parker slowly placed the phone back onto the hook, her hands clammy. Without a word, she turned and walked straight to the nearest restroom, locking the door behind her. She gripped the sink, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her face was pale for the first time. The reality of what she had done truly sank in. She had humiliated the sons of the most powerful man in the airline industry, and now she had to answer for it. Samantha Parker splashed cold water on her face, gripping the edges of the small sink inside the lavatory. Her reflection stared back at her, but for the first time she didn't recognize the confident, in-control flight attendant she had always been. She had made a mistake, a serious one, and now the weight of it was pressing down on her like never before. She had thought an apology would be enough to smooth things over, that a quiet return to first class would end the matter. But it hadn't. The sickly mood was reinforced by a sense that it would never be enough. James Harrington wasn't letting this go, and deep down she knew why. This wasn't just about his sons. This was about every passenger she had judged unfairly over the years. Every moment when she had let her assumptions dictate her decisions. The only difference this time was that she had picked the wrong people to treat unfairly. A sharp knock on the door made her flinch. "Samantha, it is Jack Turner," came the voice of the senior flight attendant. "We need you back out here." She swallowed, steadying her breath before unlocking the door. When she stepped out, Jack Turner's expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "We just got word from ground control," he said in a low voice, leading her away from the other flight attendants. "Security is waiting at the gate when we land." Samantha Parker's stomach twisted violently. "Security," she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack Turner nodded, not for an emergency but for an escort. He hesitated before adding, "For you." She stared at him. Jack Turner glanced around, lowering his voice even more. James Harrington made a personal request. Samantha Parker's breath hitched. A personal request that meant this wasn't going to be handled quietly. "This is serious. How bad is this?" she asked, forcing her voice to stay level. Jack Turner exhaled. "They're calling a review hearing immediately after we land. That doesn't happen unless the company is considering serious action." Samantha Parker felt her throat close up. She had been with the airline for 15 years. She had given everything to this job, and now it could all be gone because of one moment, one assumption she hadn't thought twice about until it was too late. She turned her gaze toward the first-class cabin. Ian Harrington and Rylan Harrington were completely at ease, lounging in their seats and scrolling through their phones. They weren't gloating, they weren't even looking in her direction, but they didn't have to. They had already won. Ava Williams stepped closer, her arms crossed as she studied Samantha Parker's face, which was starting to sink in now. "Isn't it obvious?" Ava Williams remarked. Samantha Parker clenched her jaw. "I'll handle it," she insisted. Eva Williams scoffed. "Handle it? You still don't get it. This isn't about handling it. This is about what happens when someone with real power decides to hold you accountable." Samantha Parker's fingers curled into fists at her sides. She wasn't used to feeling powerless, but here she was, completely trapped in the consequences of her own actions. The worst part, that she had done this to herself. Jack Turner glanced at his watch. "We land in 30 minutes. You should probably start thinking about what you're going to say." Samantha Parker nodded stiffly, but her mind was already racing. For the first time in her career, she wasn't sure there was anything she could say to fix this. The final 30 minutes of the flight felt like the longest of her career. Every second dragged as her mind ran through possible explanations, excuses, or ways to soften the damage, but the reality was suffocating. There was no way out of this. She stood near the galley, gripping the counter, staring blankly at the service card in front of her. Eva Williams, Jack Turner, and the rest of the crew knew what was coming. No one said it out loud, but she could feel it in their stolen glances, in the way they moved around her as if she were already gone. Over the intercom, Captain Robert Flynn's voice came through, calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and tray tables are in their upright positions. We will be landing shortly." Samantha Parker inhaled sharply. 20 minutes later, she glanced toward first class. Ian Harrington and Rylan Harrington sat comfortably, their expressions unreadable. They hadn't spoken to her since she brought them back to their seats, but she could feel them watching. Not out of spite, not out of anger, but with the quiet confidence of knowing they had already won. Rylan Harrington leaned toward his brother, whispering something before unlocking his phone. Samantha Parker's stomach dropped when she saw him type another message. She knew who he was texting. James Harrington. And she had no doubt that whatever he was telling their father would only make things worse for her. A few rows back, a businessman in seat 4A adjusted his tie uncomfortably. He had been one of the many passengers who had watched everything unfold earlier, but had chosen to say nothing. Now, as Samantha Parker passed him, he finally spoke. "I hope you learned something from this," he muttered, not even looking at her. Samantha Parker stiffened from across the aisle. The woman in seat 3D, the one who had questioned her earlier, shook her head. "The world is changing," she said quietly. "You should have changed with it." Samantha Parker felt a heat rush to her face. It wasn't just about James Harrington anymore. Everyone on this flight knew what she had done. They weren't just waiting to see what happened to her when they landed, they were expecting it. The fastened seatbelt sign dinged on. Samantha Parker moved stiffly back to the galley, gripping the edge of the counter so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Eva Williams stood beside her, arms crossed. "Still think you can handle it?" Eva Williams asked. Samantha Parker didn't answer, because for the first time in her career she didn't know if she could. The plane dipped lower as it prepared for landing, the soft hum of the engines filling the cabin. Passengers adjusted their seatbelts, some stretching, others peering out the windows to catch a glimpse of the approaching runway. For most of them, this was just another flight ending. But for Samantha Parker, it was the beginning of the end. She stood in the galley, gripping the counter so tightly that every second that passed was another step closer to whatever punishment awaited her. She could already picture it. Walking off the plane, security waiting, the hushed whispers of airline staff as she was pulled aside. Would she be fired on the spot? Would she be given a chance to explain herself? No, there was nothing to explain. The reality of what she had done had finally settled into her bones. She had made a decision not out of policy, not out of procedure, but out of assumption. And now she was about to pay for it in front of everyone. From first class, Ian Harrington adjusted his seatbelt while keeping his phone in his lap, waiting for the final message from their father. Rylan Harrington, on the other hand, was enjoying himself. He smirked slightly as he scrolled through his phone, already imagining the scene that was about to unfold when they landed. "Think he's waiting for us?" Rylan Harrington asked, nudging his brother. Ian Harrington nodded definitely. "And I don't think he's alone." Rylan Harrington's grin widened. "Oof, she's about to have the worst day of her life." From the galley, Samantha Parker overheard them, her stomach twisted. Eva Williams noticed the way Samantha Parker's face paled and the way her body tensed at the sound of Rylan Harrington's voice. Eva Williams let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. "You're scared," she said. Samantha Parker's eyes snapped to her. "I am not," she insisted. Eva Williams raised an eyebrow. "Really?" She gestured toward first class. "Because those two, they're not worried about a thing. They're sitting back, relaxing, knowing that their dad is about to handle this in a way you never saw coming." Samantha Parker's pulse quickened. "I've been in difficult situations before," she muttered. Eva Williams tilted her head slightly. "And how many of those situations involved the man who owns the airline demanding an explanation for why you publicly humiliated his kids?" Samantha Parker had no response. The cabin grew eerily silent as the plane made its final approach. Passengers straightened in their seats, gripping armrests as the aircraft hovered just above the runway. Then a smooth landing. The wheels touched down with a gentle bounce, the engines roaring as the plane slowed. The overhead lights flickered slightly and a few passengers let out relieved sighs. For most people on board, the flight was over. For Samantha Parker, it was just beginning. The intercom crackled again. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. Please remain seated until we reach the gate and the seatbelt sign is turned off. On behalf of the crew, thank you for flying with us today," the announcement declared. As soon as the announcement ended, Samantha Parker saw it through the small opening in the galley curtain. She could see the jet bridge moving into place, and standing just outside the window, a group of men in dark suits. Her breath caught in her throat. They weren't airport security, they weren't random executives, they were personal staff from the CEO's office. James Harrington's men, waiting. Passengers in first class noticed too. The murmur started instantly. Ian Harrington glanced out the window and smirked. Rylan Harrington let out a quiet chuckle. "Oh yeah," Rylan Harrington whispered. "She's done." The fastened seatbelt sign dinged off. The plane doors would open soon, and when they did, Samantha Parker had nowhere to hide. Jack Turner walked up beside her, his face blank, his voice unreadable. "They're waiting for you," Jack Turner said. Samantha Parker's pulse thundered in her ears. She forced herself to breathe. She had always thought she had power. She had always thought she was the one in charge. But she had never been more wrong. The moment the seatbelt sign turned off, a hush fell over the plane. Normally, this was the part where passengers rushed to stand, grabbing bags from the overhead bins, eager to leave. But this time, no one moved right away. Everyone felt something was about to happen. Samantha Parker's hands were ice cold. She gripped the cart in the galley, steadying herself, forcing herself to think. What could she say? What defense could she possibly give when the man waiting for her owned the very company she worked for? Through the small window of the cabin door, she could see them standing just outside the jet bridge. 3 men in dark suits, arms crossed, earpieces in their ears. They weren't normal airline staff. They were Harrington's people. And they were here for. Her passengers finally started standing, pulling bags down, stretching their legs. But even as they moved, their eyes kept darting toward the front of the plane. The tension was suffocating. Ian Harrington took his time unbuckling his seatbelt. He wasn't in a rush. Rylan Harrington, on the other hand, was already standing, casually rolling his shoulders like he was getting ready for a show. "I can't wait to see her face," Rylan Harrington muttered to his brother. Ian Harrington smirked. "She already knows from the galley." Samantha Parker heard them, and for the first time since this ordeal started, she felt something she hadn't before. Panic. Jack Turner appeared beside her, his expression unreadable. "You need to go out there." Samantha Parker didn't move. Jack Turner exhaled sharply. "Look, avoiding it isn't going to change anything. You made a bad call, now you have to face it." She clenched her jaw. "I was doing my job." Jack Turner gave her a long, exhausted look. "Were you?" Samantha Parker's throat tightened. The cabin doors unlocked. A quiet hiss filled the air as the door cracked open, and the jet bridge fully connected. A uniformed security officer stepped in first, then right behind him came a man in a charcoal suit, calm and composed, his presence dominating the small entryway. The entire plane seemed to hold its breath. Samantha Parker already knew who he was. Lucas Shaw, James Harrington's right-hand man, the head of airline operations, the man who handled internal problems before they turned into public scandals. He was here for her. Lucas Shaw stepped forward, his sharp gaze sweeping the cabin before settling on Samantha Parker. The second their eyes met, her stomach dropped. Passengers stared and flight attendants held still. Lucas Shaw didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Samantha Parker," he said smoothly, his tone polite yet firm, "you'll need to come with us." Samantha Parker's fingers clenched into fists at her sides. She felt every single eye in that cabin on her. Hell Lima was watching, arms folded, expression unreadable. Jack Turner shifted uncomfortably beside her, but he didn't speak. And then there were the passengers. Some of them tried to pretend they weren't listening, keeping their heads down, scrolling on their phones. But others, they watched the woman in seat 3. Dee, the one who had questioned Samantha Parker's actions earlier, pressed her lips together. The businessman in seat 4A, the one who had muttered at her before landing, shook his head slightly, his disappointment evident. They all knew what this was. Samantha Parker had been judged, and now she was about to be sentenced. For a brief, desperate moment, she considered making a scene, arguing, defending herself, saying that she was just following procedure, that this was all a misunderstanding. but she knew it wouldn't matter. Lucas Shaw wasn't here for excuses. Samantha Parker stepped forward the moment she did. Whispers spread through the cabin like wildfire. This was it. She was being escorted off the plane. Passengers moved aside as she walked down the aisle. Some refused to meet her eyes. Others watched intently, murmuring among themselves. Ian Harrington sat calmly watching her pass without a word, while Rylan Harrington, on the other hand, smirked slightly. Not out of cruelty, but because justice had been served. As Samantha Parker reached the front of the plane, she hesitated. She turned slightly, glancing back at first class at the seats where the two boys sat, the seats that had been theirs all along. She had been so sure they didn't belong, and now she was the one being forced to leave. Lucas Shaw motioned toward the jet bridge. "After you." With one final breath, Samantha Parker stepped off the plane. And just like that, she was gone. The moment Samantha Parker stepped off the plane, the cabin erupted into whispers. It was as if an unspoken tension had suddenly broken, a shift in energy that every passenger felt. Some exchanged glances. Others murmured in hushed voices, piecing together what they had just witnessed. She had been removed, escorted off her own flight. Elima, still standing near the galley, let out a slow breath and shook her head. "Wow," she muttered under her breath. Jack Turner ran a hand down his face, exhaling. "That was brutal." In first class, Ian Harrington adjusted his watch, calm as ever, while Rylan Harrington, however, was grinning. Rylan Harrington whispered, leaning toward his brother, "Was worth every second." Aeon smirked. She didn't see it coming. She thought she had power. Rylan Harrington said, shaking his head, "But she didn't." Ian Harrington tapped his fingers against the armrest. "Dad's not done yet." Rylan Harrington raised an eyebrow. "You think he'll fire her?" Ian Harrington thought for a moment, then shrugged. "I think he'll make sure she never forgets this flight." Meanwhile, outside the planes, Samantha Parker walked down the jet bridge, her heart pounding. She could feel Lucas Shaw behind her, his presence heavy, his steps measured. He wasn't rushing her. He didn't need to. She had nowhere to go. At the end of the jet bridge, two more men in suits stood waiting. One held a tablet, the other a folder. Samantha Parker's breath felt tight in her chest. This was happening. As soon as she reached the open terminal, Lucas Shaw stepped in front of her, blocking her path. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't look angry, but the authority in his expression was undeniable. "Ms. Parker," he said smoothly, "you will come with us to the executive office." Samantha Parker forced herself to breathe. "Am I—" She swallowed, rephrasing, "Will I be given a chance to explain my side?" Lucas Shaw didn't blink. "You'll be given a chance to submit a formal statement, but I'd choose your words carefully." Bora clenched her fists. "I've worked for this airline for 15 years. Lucas Shaw's expression didn't change. "And in a single flight, you damaged the company's reputation, alienated premium passengers, and made a decision that has now reached the highest level of corporate review." He tilted his head. "That's impressive in a way." Samantha Parker felt her stomach drop. She had expected consequences, maybe a suspension, maybe a quiet reprimand, but this she hadn't expected, to become a public example. Lucas Shaw turned slightly, motioning toward the corridor. "Let's go." Samantha Parker hesitated for a fraction of a second, but she knew she had no choice. Her career, her future depended on what happened next. She walked forward. Lucas Shaw and the two suited men flanked her. They didn't touch her, they didn't push her, but the message was clear. She wasn't in control anymore. Back on the plane, the passengers were still talking about what had happened when the announcement came over the speakers. "This is your captain speaking." We have now reached the gate. The crew will begin deplaning shortly. Thank you for flying with us today." Rylan Harrington stretched his arms. "Guess it's time to go." Ian Harrington nodded, standing up. And grabbing his backpack, he glanced at the remaining flight attendants. None of them dared meet his eyes as they walked toward the exit. A few passengers stepped aside, giving them space. Some even offered small nods of respect. It wasn't just about what had happened with Samantha Parker. It was about what it represented. The silent, unspoken rule of the world was that people like them had to prove they belonged, that no matter how hard they worked or how much they earned, someone would always question whether they deserved to be there. Not today. Today, someone else had been forced to answer for their actions, and everyone saw it. As they stepped off the plane, a familiar figure stood waiting for them at the terminal entrance. Tall, commanding, dressed in a sleek charcoal suit, James Harrington, their father, grinned. Ian Harrington smirked. "Let's see how this plays out," he said. They walked forward, and the moment their father's eyes met theirs, they knew this wasn't over yet. James Harrington stood with his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable as his sons approached. His presence alone was enough to command attention. A sharp suit, precise posture, a quiet intensity that never needed to be loud to be heard. Behind him, several corporate executives and senior airline staff stood waiting, their faces tight with unease. They knew exactly why they were here. Ian Harrington and Rylan Harrington walked forward, their steps unhurried, carrying the same calmness their father did. They weren't nervous. They didn't have to be. The second they reached him, James took a long, measured look at both of them. "You good?" he asked simply. Ian Harrington nodded. "Yeah." Rylan Harrington smirked. "More than good." James held their gazes for another moment before turning his attention to the group of airline executives standing behind him. One of them, a nervous-looking man with silver-rimmed glasses, stepped forward. "Mr. Harrington, we sincerely apologize for—" James held up a hand and the man immediately shut his mouth. A slow, heavy silence settled over the terminal. People were watching now. Not just airline staff, but passengers passing through, who stole glances from behind their phones, whispering among themselves. It wasn't every day the CEO of the airline personally showed up to handle a situation. James let the silence stretch before finally speaking. "Where is she?" The suited men exchanged uneasy glances. "She's on her way to the executive office," one of them answered carefully. James nodded once. "Good." He shifted his gaze toward his sons again, as if studying them for any signs of frustration or anger. But Ian and Rylan stood with the same calm, measured confidence he had taught them. James exhaled sharply, then spoke again, this time loud enough for everyone around him to hear. "I want to make something very clear," he said. "Not just to my staff, but to every person in this airport right now." The tension thickened instantly. This isn't about two boys getting removed from their seats. This is about the fact that no matter how much success, education, or wealth you have, there will always be someone who looks at you and decides you don't belong here. A few of the executives shifted uncomfortably, but they didn't interrupt. James glanced toward his sons. "Today, that someone was one of my employees, and today, that someone learned that accountability applies to everyone." Ian grinned. Rylan smirked. They weren't just watching justice unfold, they were a part of it. James turned back to the executives. "I expect a full investigation into not just this incident, but the overall training of all crew members. I want a report on my desk by morning." His voice dropped slightly, dangerously controlled, and added, And if I find out that this wasn't an isolated issue, then the next person losing their job won't be a flight attendant. It'll be someone sitting in an office." No one spoke. They all knew better. James finally turned toward his sons again. "Let's go with that." He walked past the executives, his sons following effortlessly at his side. They didn't need to hear any more. They had already won. Meanwhile, in the executive office, Samantha Parker sat in a cold, modern conference room, her hands folded in her lap. Across from her, a long glass table stretched toward the far end of the room, where two senior airline officials sat, flipping through a thick folder. Her folder. She could feel the weight of their judgment, the silent calculation behind their eyes. She wasn't just any flight attendant anymore. She was a liability. The man sitting closest to her, a serious-looking executive named Henry Mitchell, finally looked up. His gaze was sharp, unreadable. "You've been with the airline for 15 years. Not a single major complaint on your record," he stated. Samantha Parker nodded stiffly. "That's correct." Henry leaned back in his chair. "And yet today you made a call that resulted in you being removed from your own flight by corporate security." Samantha swallowed hard. "It was a mistake." Henry didn't blink. "A mistake?" Samantha kept her back straight. "I misjudged the situation." Henry exchanged a brief glance with the woman sitting beside him. Another executive, Olivia Brooks. She tapped a neatly manicured nail against the table. "We have to ask," Olivia said, her voice smooth but firm. "Did you ask anyone else in first class to show their tickets?" Samantha hesitated. The silence stretched too long. Olivia's expression didn't change. That was a yes or no question. Samantha's hands tightened into fists beneath the table. "No." Henry let out a small sigh, tapping the folder in front of him. "You didn't verify the manifest? You didn't check with the gate agent? You assumed that two unaccompanied young black boys in first class didn't belong there." He shut the folder. "That's not a mistake, Miss Parker. That's a decision." Samantha's mouth felt dry. I didn't mean..." Olivia cut in. "Because you never questioned anyone else. You didn't pause. You didn't think twice. You saw them, and decided Samantha Parker's breathing was uneven." Now Henry Mitchell leaned forward. "You were one of the most senior flight attendants on that flight. That means you set the example, and today the example you set was that rules only apply to some people." Samantha Parker felt sick. For years she had enforced rules, policies, and procedures without hesitation, but now she was the one sitting in front of people who had already decided her fate. Henry Mitchell exhaled. "We're still reviewing how this will be handled, but I can tell you this much. Your future with this airline is uncertain." Samantha Parker felt a cold weight settle in her chest. Olivia Brooks glanced toward the security officer standing by the door. "Escort Samantha Parker off the premises for now." Samantha Parker's throat tightened. She was not suspended, not written up, escorted. She was being removed from the building. Samantha Parker stood slowly, her legs shaky. The security officer opened the door for her, waiting. The moment she stepped out, she wasn't just a flight attendant anymore. She was the woman who had humiliated the CEO's sons, and now she was the one who didn't belong. The cold air outside the corporate office felt different as Samantha Parker stepped out. Her body stiff, her movements robed. The weight of the last few hours settled over her like a crushing blanket. She had lost control of everything. The security officer, a middle-aged man with a neutral expression, didn't touch her, didn't say a word, but his presence was enough. He didn't have to escort her physically. The humiliation had already done its job. She stepped onto the sidewalk, blinking as the bright afternoon sun hit her face. The sounds of the city moved around her, cars honking, people walking past, their lives continuing as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just watched her entire career crumble into dust. Her phone vibrated in her pocket for a split second. She considered ignoring it, but then curiosity won. She pulled it out, her heart plummeting when she saw the notification. Breaking news. Airline executive James Harrington addresses first-class incident involving sons. Samantha Parker's stomach twisted as she tapped the article. The first image she saw was of James Harrington standing in the airport terminal, his sons on either side of him. The headline underneath made her skin go cold. No one should have to prove they belong where they already are. Her fingers trembled as she scrolled. The article detailed the entire incident, written in a calm yet damning tone. It described how 2 young black passengers were removed from their first-class seats without proper verification, how the flight attendant responsible had been escorted off the plane, how the CEO of the airline had personally stepped in to ensure the situation was handled at the highest level. Then, at the very bottom was a statement from James Harrington himself. "My sons did not need to prove their right to sit in first class. Their presence was enough. But someone on my airline, a place where fairness and professionalism should be absolute, chose to believe otherwise. This is not just about 2 passengers. It is about a culture that has allowed moments like this to happen over and over again, unchecked. That changes today." Samantha Parker felt her stomach churn. Her name wasn't in the article, but it didn't have to be. Everyone who had been on that flight knew exactly who it was, and now the entire world knew what she had done. She looked up from her phone, her breath uneven. A few feet away, near the entrance of the corporate building, a group of airline employees stood in a circle, their heads bent over their phones. She didn't have to guess what they were reading. One of them looked up, their eyes meeting hers for a fraction of a second. Then, without a word, they turned away. Samantha Parker's chest tightened painfully. She had always prided herself on being respected, on having authority, on being someone people listened to. But now she wasn't a leader. She wasn't a senior flight attendant. She was a headline, a cautionary tale, a name people would whisper about in break rooms. Her phone vibrated again with another news update. Samantha Parker didn't check it. Instead, for the first time in years, she felt something she had rarely ever experienced. She felt small. She turned and walked away from the corporate office, her steps slower than they had ever been, and, for the first time in 15 years, she had no idea where she was going next. Back at the Harrington estate, the ride home was quiet, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Ian Harrington and Rylan Harrington sat across from their father in the back of the sleek black car. The leather seats were cool beneath them. Their father hadn't spoken much since they left the airport, but he didn't have to. Ian Harrington checked his phone, scrolling through the news. "They're all talking about it," he said. Rylan Harrington grinned, kicking his feet up slightly. "Good," James Harrington said. He didn't react immediately. He simply rested his elbow on the car door, looking out the tinted window. After a long moment, he finally spoke. "Are you satisfied?" Rylan Harrington shrugged. "I mean, yeah, she got what she deserved." James Harrington finally looked at them. "And what exactly did she deserve?" Ian Harrington raised an eyebrow. "She humiliated us. She didn't even think twice before kicking us off that plane. If you hadn't stepped in, she would have gotten away with it." James Harrington studied them carefully. "That's not what I asked. The car fell silent. Rylan Harrington shifted slightly in his seat. She needed to learn, James Harrington nodded slowly, and now she has. He leaned back, his expression unreadable, but then continued, "Understand something. Both of you need to remember, power isn't just about what you can take from someone. It's about what you choose to do with it." Rylan Harrington frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" James Harrington sighed, rolling his shoulders slightly. "That woman lost everything today, not because you made it happen, but because she made a choice, and now she's dealing with the consequences. But there's something you both need to remember." Ian Harrington leaned forward. "What's that?" James Harrington met their eyes, his gaze unwavering. "You don't need revenge when the truth speaks for itself." Another silence settled over them. Rylan Harrington exhaled, sinking into his seat. "So what happens now?" James Harrington checked his watch. "Now we move forward." He glanced out the window again, watching as the city lights flickered past. "I already told you," he murmured, "no one should ever have to prove they belong where they already are." Rylan Harrington smirked. "You should put that on a t-shirt." James Harrington chuckled, shaking his head. "Not necessary." Ian Harrington smiled slightly. "Why not?" James Harrington closed his eyes briefly before answering. "Because after today..." He opened his eyes again, his expression unreadable. "No one is ever going to forget it." The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the city skyline as James Harrington's car pulled into the driveway of their estate. The gates slid open without hesitation, and the vehicle moved smoothly down the long, tree-lined path leading to their home. Everything about their arrival felt normal, calm, controlled, and yet everything had changed. As the car came to a stop, Ian Harrington stretched his arms while Rylan Harrington let out a long breath, the energy of the day finally settling into his bones. It had been a victory, but one that came with weight. The three of them stepped out of the car. The air was crisp, carrying the distant hum of the city behind them. For the first time in hours, they weren't being watched. No more passengers, no more cameras, no more whispers. Just them. Inside, the familiar scent of cedarwood and faint cologne filled the entryway. Their home was a mix of modern elegance and warmth. High ceilings, sleek lines, but still inviting. This wasn't just a place where business deals were made. It was where they lived. James Harrington loosened his tie slightly, rolling his shoulders. He wasn't a man who carried exhaustion visibly, but today had been a rare exception. Today hadn't just been about his sons, it had been about something much bigger. Ian Harrington and Rylan Harrington exchanged a glance before following him into the spacious living room. Rylan Harrington flopped onto the couch. "So she's done, right?" Ian Harrington sat down more slowly, setting his phone on the table. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think she knows that too." James Harrington remained standing, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city stretching beyond their home. The lights flickered, cars moved below, and the world continued on for everyone else. It was just another evening, but for Samantha Parker, her world had just collapsed, and he had made sure she felt it. Rylan Harrington smirked. "I kind of wish I could see her face right now." James Harrington exhaled slowly. "And what would that change?" Rylan Harrington blinked. James Harrington finally turned to face them, his expression unreadable. "What difference would it make if you saw her face, if you watched her regret it?" Rylan Harrington hesitated, shifting slightly in his seat. "I mean, it'd just be satisfying, that's all." James Harrington let out a quiet, knowing chuckle. "Satisfying?" He nodded, almost to himself, before taking a seat across from them. You think what happened today was about satisfaction? Ian Harrington leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. It was about correction. James Harrington raised an eyebrow. Was it? Ian Harrington didn't back down. She had power, and she used it to make us feel like we didn't belong. You made sure she understood that she was the one who didn't belong. James Harrington studied his son for a long moment before responding. You're not wrong. Rylan Harrington crossed his arms. Then, what's the problem? James Harrington sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. The problem, he said steadily, is that if all you take from this is the satisfaction of seeing someone fall, then you haven't learned anything at all. Rylan Harrington frowned slightly. What else were we supposed to learn? James Harrington leaned forward, his gaze steady. Power isn't about revenge, Rylan. It's about responsibility. You're going to go through life and people will judge you before they know you. They will assume things, underestimate you, try to push you into corners where you have to prove yourself. His voice dropped slightly. You will be questioned in rooms where you should be leading. You will be looked at like an outsider in spaces where you belong. Rylan Harrington and Ian Harrington listened carefully. Now, and yes, James Harrington admitted, sometimes those people will get exactly what they deserve. Sometimes the world will see them fall. He glanced out the window again before turning back to them. But that's not what makes you powerful. What makes you powerful is the choice you make after you've won. Rylan Harrington sat back, thinking. So what, we just forgive her? James Harrington gave a small, quiet smile. No, you don't have to forgive her, he exhaled. But you don't have to carry her with you either. Ian Harrington absorbed that, nodding slowly. We move forward. James Harrington nodded exactly. Rylan Harrington clicked his tongue. So, no victory dance? James Harrington smirked. You can celebrate, his voice turned just slightly sharper. But don't let your celebration turn into arrogance. Rylan Harrington rolled his eyes but grinned. Fine, fine. James Harrington leaned back in his chair. Now, tell me, what did you learn today? Ian Harrington spoke first. That people like her never think they're wrong until they have no choice but to face it. James Harrington nodded. Good. Rylan Harrington leaned forward. That we don't need to prove we belong. James Harrington smiled slightly. Better. Ian Harrington sat up straighter. And that the best revenge is letting the truth do the work for you. Rylan Harrington smiled fully. Now. Perfect. Rylan Harrington groaned. Sheesh, why do you always make things so philosophical? James Harrington laughed. Because the sooner you understand how the world works, the sooner you learn how to navigate it. Ian Harrington stood, stretching his arms. I don't know about you, but I need food. Rylan Harrington hopped up after him. Oh yes, we deserve the best dinner ever for today's performance. James Harrington stood as well, shaking his head as his sons walked toward the kitchen. Arrogance, he muttered with amusement. Rylan Harrington turned around with a grin. No, Dad. Confidence. James Harrington smirked. We'll see about that. The night stretched on, the city moved beyond their walls, the world continued to turn. Today had been about justice, about power, about a lesson that wouldn't be forgotten. And as the Harringtons sat down for dinner, the world outside was still talking, but none of them had to say a word, because after today, the message had already been received. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.